Welcome back, everyone, to part two of our screencast on economic globalization. We're certainly coming at it from an educational perspective, but putting an economic lens on it today. And we're talking a little bit about what is neoliberalism, just as a refresher for those of you who have been inundated with neoliberalism and its sort of description and characteristics in other courses, and as it points out here, a primer on education, or on neoliberalism, pardon me, and make sure I've got my pointer all set up. A primer on neoliberalism down here. If you want to go to this website, you can find more of this text to look at. And we talked about some of the characteristics of a neoliberal perspective or neoliberal ideology. And we kind of rushed on these last few because we were running out of our 15 minutes of fame from the first screencast. So let me go over and just summarize briefly and then spend a little more time on these last parts. One is the rule of the market, and we talked about that being free market, the idea of, sort of let things be, laissez-faire approach. We talked about the idea of reducing public expenditure for social services like education, being a neoliberal approach to how to run a stronger economy. We talked about the idea of deregulation, which is this free market idea where you allow market forces to act as a self-regulating mechanism. And we were starting to, well, we mentioned the privatization of public enterprise, things like, again, education. So you want to take a neoliberal approach to education at the national level. Well, one way that you can do that is to reduce public expenditure on education, and that would then also go hand in hand with privatization of educational services or functions or whatever. And then we have this idea of, let's see if I can get this to right, this idea of changing perceptions of public and community good to individualism and individual responsibility. So the idea is that we're shifting to accountability for individuals. And a lot of people have pointed out that you can see that very heavily in the standards, accountability, and assessment movements that have gripped national education systems worldwide. Now, overlapping with what we saw above, also from this website down here, right, is what Richard Robbins, in his book Global Problems in the Culture of Capitalism, summarizes about some of the guiding principles behind the ideology of neoliberalism. And remember, these sound kind of positive, so let's go with how we might think of this from a neoliberal perspective before we go to the left and take a much more critical perspective. One is that if we take this sort of a system and implement it, then sustained economic growth is the way to human progress. That's an idea behind neoliberalism. Sustained economic growth is the way to human progress. And that's the point then, if we're coming from an education standpoint, of education is to support or sustain or encourage human progress. We can also say that free markets without government interference would be the most efficient and socially optimal allocation of resources. Now, there are those that have argued very strongly that education is an allocation system. And one of the reasons why John Mayer came up with his idea of education as an institution was to look for alternatives to this allocation of resources approach. So it's an interesting contrast between neoliberalism and its ideology and the way that neo-institutional perspectives arose. The idea is that economic globalization benefits everyone because it allows, again, free movement, free market decisions, free market usage of any sort of economic, or in this case, our case, educational resource. That privatization removes the inefficiency of the public sector, partly because in a market-based system, the idea is that people will only pay for, people will only expend resources or share their sort of rare opportunities if it's going to advantage them somehow, if they see a benefit from it. So nobody will go to, this is the neoliberal argument, right? Nobody would go to a declining school or a failing school because they would be able to select another school or another education system that would be much more advantageous to them, and they would still only be spending the same amount of resources in using that other system. And finally, there's the ideology that government should mainly function to provide the infrastructure to advance the rule of law with respect to property rights and contracts. In other words, governments might provide the infrastructure, and I'm going to take some of that out and say infrastructure to education, and then the way that that infrastructure was used could be privatized on a free market system, which would lead to human progress. So you can see how this argument can kind of fit together. And what's interesting about the neoliberal argument is that we can sort of trace it back a little bit, or a lot of bit. And I realize that we're in a comparative and international education class where we're looking comparatively across educational systems, and we're talking about globalization. But I want to talk about this guy for a second right here. This is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson. Some of you may recognize him as I believe, the second president of the United States. Very famous American during the period of our nation's birth. It sounds so dramatic when you say it that way. Author of the Declaration of Independence, etc., etc. Also a slaveholder, Virginia plantation man. He has many roles that he's played. One of those, however, is to be a really interesting example of classical liberalism. You know, since we're talking about neoliberalism leading up to this, the idea of classical liberalism and sort of the liberalist idea that preceded neoliberalism, I think is important to understand. And one of the reasons why it's important is because Thomas Jefferson and the way that he thought about education has had a remarkable impact on the development of education and educational systems in certainly the United States, and then over time in many other parts of the world. Because as we talked about earlier, educational models from the West or the global North have spread worldwide in the form of formal mass education systems for the large part. So several concepts that I want to highlight, one of them being this faith in reason. The idea that we can reason with or rationalize our way to the right answer, to the way of thinking about what is good or true or will benefit society. And one of the reasons why this is important is because this was a significant shift from more medieval ideology, which had faith in God as the main tenet. So this has a real emphasis on humans and their rational capacity. That's important. The other was this idea in natural law, that there was an expectation that there were things that existed in the universe that were absolute truths, and that these absolute truths were natural laws that, even though we might encounter them in different ways or experience them in different ways, they were still true. Gravity would be a good example of this, right? But the idea was that then you could take these natural law ideas and you can bring them into other sorts of investigations. I don't think at the time Thomas Jefferson was thinking about it this way necessarily, but I think the interpretation from classical liberalism to neoliberalism is that there were natural laws that might have occurred in the world, the natural world, like gravity that I just mentioned. But then there would also be natural laws that would occur in society or in politics or in the economy. Now, again, I'm extrapolating quite a bit, and we're not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail, so there's a lot we're missing in this discussion, and be aware of that. But understanding that there was this expectation that there might be some universals out there that would apply rather broadly was an important one. The idea of a Republican virtue is one that we could actually debate for quite a long time. But a Republican is someone who belongs to the Republic. right? Someone who is part of the republic. And the idea that by being a part of that community, you were contributing something to society was an important way to think about the influence of liberalism on economic, political, and cultural globalization as well. We've already talked a little bit about the neoliberal emphasis on progress, and we have the same thing with classical liberalism, that we're always sort of aiming for how can we make things better? How can we move forward? How can we advantage everyone, as broadly speaking as possible? The idea of nationalism was something that was emphasized during this classical liberal period, and certainly by Thomas Jefferson. Being able to think of yourself as part of a nation, as having some sort of affiliation with other people, even though they might not be necessarily your family in terms of your mother, brother, sister, father, whatever, but they were a nation connected to you by a shared culture, a shared society, a shared language, a shared ideology, a shared whatever. And then this emphasis on freedom, or the idea that you can make decisions based on your own interests in your own individual context, rather than having to be told or being limited by what others would decide for you. So if we think about this classical liberal idea, and quite frankly, I think it's rather easy to make an argument that there are a lot of positives that could come out of this, and that perhaps did come out of this in the development of political, economic, and cultural systems worldwide. But if we think about then the other way of thinking about liberalism, this neoliberalism, and the way that is sort of carried forward to the present, well, we start to think of more criticisms or more critiques. Let's take a moment, though, to look at some of the ways that this classical liberalism manifested itself through Jefferson in particular. Because I think, again, the way that the American educational system developed has had a surprisingly influential role in the way that educational systems in other parts of the world have developed as well. Now, remember, one of Jefferson's political ideals was a representative republic composed of educated, informed, and rational citizens. And this fits very nicely with the classical liberal approach, or the classical liberal philosophy. And as a result, Jefferson himself came up with a bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge. You can see that in its original text here. By the way, if you Google it, it comes up. You can get the full text online anytime you want. The idea was that this was a bill that was actually put forward to the Virginia legislature and was not approved when it was put forward, by the way, when Jefferson did it. And what he called for was a plan for elementary school, grammar school, university, and then lifelong self-instruction. And I'm not going to go through the whole plan with you, because I think that's for another class another time. But it was the first idea in the United States, anyway, for a popular education plan. As limited as it actually was, it did have a popular ring to it. And the idea was that all free or land-owning men in Jefferson's era, remember this is Jefferson's era, so the ways that they're defining society are going to be significantly different, certainly not ways that we would ever consider appropriate now. But if the idea was that all free or landowning men and their children, their male children, would have the opportunity to attend an elementary school where they would learn the basics: reading, writing, arithmetic, and some history. And that from that group, a select few would be chosen then to move on to grammar school and university. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Elementary school, women would go to. It was grammar school where it was limited to boys. And then the select group could then move on to university, and the idea is that we would create this self-instruction, these self-learning individuals that would become the educated, informed, rational citizens of the new republic. And he also had a rather, remember, for the time, a rather liberal idea of education for women and for African American slaves. I guess at that time maybe they weren't African American. They were African slaves. So Jefferson thought it essential to give women a solid education which might enable them, when become mothers, to educate their own daughters and even to direct the course for sons should their fathers be lost or incapable or inattentive. This is a letter that he wrote to Nathaniel Burwell in 1818. Again, he's expressing expectations and ideologies that we don't express now. Another one, Jefferson suggested that the Virginia government create a public education system for slaves based on his plan for the more general diffusion of knowledge as one step in preparing them for freedom. But the idea that this would be a popular education plan is really the crux of this. And so making education as open to the public as possible is the positive spin on neoliberal ideology.